Welcome to Beginner Breakdown. I'm Matt Barrett, Scholastic Coordinator. I'm subbing for Mike Cummer today. The topic of the class is opening pitfalls, or traps in the opening. I thought this was a topic that we could cover on a beginner level, just going through a few openings and seeing what works and what doesn't. Now, the books that influenced me most when I first started learning chess, my father got me a book by Reuben Fine called The Ideas Behind the Chess Openings. And I really liked that book because it was very straightforward. It explained each opening, for example, E4, controlling two of the central squares. Let's see. Also allowing for the bishop to come out and the queen to come out. Okay, so that one made a lot of sense. And after E4, Fine said, let's go systematically through how these openings play out. How do they impact the center? If black responds the same way, what's the most direct route? And he started with the center game, D4. Now, not everyone plays this, and this might not be the strongest move, but the explanation that Fine gave was very useful, I thought. He says this is a very direct method of playing in the center. What's the expected response? Arjun. E takes D4, and now white plays queen takes D4. And what is it about this position that we say is maybe not so great for white? What is it that is the main drawback for white? Anyone? Yes?
The queen came out too early.
Good. With the queen in the middle, she might be vulnerable to attack. So knight c6 is an expected response. The main move is queen e3. You could also play queen a4. You might even play queen d3. But because you have to move the queen again, the suggestion is maybe this is a little too direct. Another book that influenced me, and it's going to be part of the inspiration for class today, is a book by Bruce Pandolfini called Chess Openings, Traps, and Zaps. And he goes through systematically where certain players may have gone wrong in a similarly direct line of openings, including the center game, the Scotch game, the Ruy Lopez, the traditional classical openings of chess. So the first one I wanted to look at was a position arising from the center game. Although it may be direct, it's not a forced loss. It's not a terrible position for white. It's just not the bigger advantage that you might get from something like the Ruy Lopez. Right? So black plays a logical move, knight f6, bishop g5, bishop e7, and white makes the mistake e5. What's wrong with e5? Right off the bat. If you don't know opening theory, you may think, because I'm attacking the knight, I'm putting pressure on that piece that I had attacked on my previous move with bishop g5, maybe this is a logical move. What's wrong with it? What can black do in response? Is there a way for black to attack two of the white pieces at once? Knight c6, good. So after knight c6, white has a problem. Anywhere he goes, queen c3 would be a big mistake because bishop b4 is coming. Queen e3 would also be a mistake if knight g4 comes. The bishop is under duress from both a bishop and a queen. The queen is being attacked by the knight at g4, and the pawn at e5 is eventually going to be captured. So this move, e5 by white, is certainly too aggressive. Now, when I've played the center game, I've tried to play it like a reverse Scandinavian and played queen a4 And I actually have, okay, so this would be this same idea. Queen A4. It looks like we've put the queen on a safer square and we just develop our pieces normally. Well, another trap that might come up here, after knight f6, knight c3, defending the e-pawn, d5, and bishop g5. Now black has a pinned knight at f6. He hasn't castled his king. And one lesson that we might take from an early central capture, d takes e4, is that if your king is in the middle, you might be opening yourself up for an attack. After knight takes e4, queen e7 may not have been a critical mistake, but the follow-up certainly is. White castles, gets his king out of the center, and the move that black can't make here is queen takes e4. This is just a question of recognizing the predicament of the black king. The bishop at f8 is blocking his escape from the center. Similarly, I guess the bishop at c8 is doing that. There's an open file for the d1 rook. So what's the move in this position? What can you do to capitalize on the vulnerable black king? The most forcing move that we would look for would be checkmate. We don't have checkmate, but we do have check. Who can we check with, and what does it do? So there are only two checks that I see, three checks that I see. Queen takes queen loses because we've just had a piece captured. Knight can take. Queen takes knight loses because we're giving away our queen. What's our third check? Yes?
I think I can win a queen.
Good. I think you can win a queen as well.
Rook to d8.
Excellent. Rook d8. And because the c6 knight is pinned and the queen is defended by the f6 knight, this capture king takes d8 loses to queen takes e4.
Or bishop takes f6.
It's an optical illusion that this knight would be able to capture, right? Because he is he's pinned. Okay. Now, the next opening I want to look at, which I think, is this what I do? Do I close the entire thing? That's what I did. Okay. So the next opening I want to look at is the Scotch opening, and this is one that I play quite a bit, and I would actually recommend it a lot more than the center game. As Reuben Fine describes the Scotch game, he says this one does play d4 early, and perhaps a little bit too early. It might have been nice to already have a pawn on c3 when we play this d4 move. But d4 puts an immediate challenge in the center. Now, two ways to play this opening that are very popular include e takes d4, bishop c4, which is the Scotch gambit, and e takes d4, knight takes d4, which is the mainline Scotch game. The Scotch gambit can present some very interesting opening challenges. If you play against someone who's not fully prepared, they don't know the opening theory, they may fall into a trap. A game I played just a couple of years ago against a strong A player, he played bishop b5, and when I played c3, he played d takes c3, and when I played b takes c3, he played a very surprising losing move, bishop e7. What can white do to take advantage of this error? I'm going to call on someone new if anyone else knows. Otherwise, I will call on the star pupil. Yes?
Does he sack the bishop on the...
So in some lines of the Scotch gambit, you can sacrifice the bishop. Now in this case, if you play bishop takes f7, it doesn't look like any of the black pieces are undefended and vulnerable, right? We don't have anyone sitting out hanging. When the bishop is at c5, we might have that. if c3 d takes queen, bishop takes f7, and now queen d5. And this is a known mistake that might happen if you play the Scotch Gambit. Maybe you can make it happen in one of your games. But when the bishop is on e7, he's a little safer. Okay, so in this position, what can we do to take advantage? And certainly the f7 square pops out to us as, okay, I'm doing the wrong thing. There we go, I've highlighted the square. So we want to double attack on this square. So we play queen d5. And now, in this game, I think my opponent was sort of shocked to see this. He played the best move, but it doesn't really help. Knight h6, after bishop takes h6, black's best move is to castle, and that's not a good sign. We can just retreat our bishop, and we're up a piece. So sometimes in the Scotch Gambit, you can get some interesting opportunities. Now, the trap I wanted to look at here involves the regular Scotch game. After bishop c5, c3, knight f6, developing a piece, attacking the e-pawn. Bishop g5, pinning the knight, castle, bishop c4, queen e7, castle, and the probable mistake, queen takes e4. Now the king, the black king, is going to get very vulnerable. So what is the beginning of our combination? How do we take advantage of this greedy pawn capture by black? Okay, what shall we do? Bishop takes knight, opening the king. And now, how do we begin to reorient pieces to attack a little bit closer to the king? I'll give you a hint. There's a very important black piece in the middle of the board, and if we attack it, it gives us a tempo to bring in another attacker. So the move is bishop to d3. And now when the queen moves, white can begin to look for opportunities to trap that queen. So queen h4. How can we continue to harass the queen? We want to bring another piece in the attack. And we don't want to allow black a chance to trade any of our attacking pieces away. So if we look at d4, we see we have a knight who's being attacked by a bishop at c5 and a knight at c6. And that knight has a very appealing outpost on f5. He can't be attacked. So when the queen moves again, can we continue to harass it? h4. And when it moves again, how many squares does it have available? It can't go here. What happens if it goes here? If it goes to e5? What would be the outcome here? What would white's plan be, Arjun?
Queen to g4.
Queen g4 followed by queen g7 mate, right? So the queen is doing an important defensive job, and that means it can't vacate this dark squared diagonal, but it's been kicked out. After g3, it simply can't go anywhere. So it seems to me that as we study traps like this, it gives us opportunities early in our games. This is the kind of thing beginning players should be looking for. If you learn these traps and your opponents don't know them, this could be a great way to get a point against someone who in the later middle game or end game maybe knows a little bit more about piece activity and enforcing moves than you do. So I do recommend learning some of these types of ideas. So recently I played a game in the Scotch, and I want to show it and ask some questions about traps and ideas along the way. I didn't play the Scotch, I played the Ruy Lopez, sorry. And there are two different ways to play the Ruy Lopez as white. You can play the bishop a4 variation, or you can play bishop takes c6. And I did a funny thing in this particular game. I thought for a very long time on move 1. And I think my reason for doing that was that I had been playing a lot of different openings recently. And so I knew that the choices that I made were going to have a big impact on the result of the game. I thought if I played a king's gambit, that my opponent might play some things that I didn't know very well. One thing we had looked at recently was this very silly f5 idea. It seems like you shouldn't be able to get away with this. When we've analyzed it with the computer says if you play it carefully enough, you're probably okay as black. And it offers an interesting sort of strategy early on. What should white do to take advantage of this funny move? White exposed his own king, and then black followed suit by exposing his king. The common move g5 is, I think, well, it was common in the 19th century, and it really isn't played anywhere near as frequently now. What's more frequent is to follow with d5, and after e takes d5 to play e4, which takes away an important square from the white knight and clogs up this e file, leaving white with a kind of a vulnerable pawn at f4, a vulnerable pawn at d5, and no real development to speak of. So black gets something for his pawn. So oftentimes when a gambit is played, the opponent will be interested in playing a counter gambit. And these things ran through my mind, and I even thought about, should I try this center game that liquidates things in the middle very quickly? But I ended up going back to this Ruy Lopez that I used to play a lot, and my favorite player played it when I was in high school. My dad said, always play what the world champions played. And so it seemed to me if I was putting together an opening repertoire for myself, I wanted to play the Ruy Lopez, I wanted to play the King's Indian, and I wanted to play the Sicilian Najdorf. And so those were the first three openings that I really learned. And I had seen that Fischer had played the exchange variation, and I had also seen many, many games with bishop a4. And it gets very positional and theoretical and complicated when you play bishop a4. There's the possibility of this open Ruy Lopez. After knight f6 castles, knight takes e4. This is played very frequently. Kramnik championed this against Kasparov, right? Practically sent Kasparov into retirement playing this way, right? Getting draw after draw with black. So this is the kind of thing that really prepared players are studying, and they understand that after these queens come off, it can be hard to upturn the black player if you're white, even if you're a champion, perhaps the greatest champion of all, Kasparov. So knowing that, and knowing also that the alternative would be this thing we call the closed Ruy Lopez, which might go something like this. There's so many games played in this line that it just doesn't seem to me, someone who hasn't studied it enough, even, and I'm saying that after having played it game after game after game when I was a kid, it seems like not the sort of thing you want to play against an opponent who you think knows the lines very well. So I played bishop takes c6. Now, in this position, this is a position that we often talk about in beginner classes. What happens if white plays knight takes e5? What's the big problem for white here? Why can't you do this? How come this move isn't played when the exchange is played? And some of you guys already know this, of course, because we go through this either in classes here, or this is one of the early things that you want to learn as a tournament player. So what do you do?
Queen to D4.
Queen D4, and you attack 2 pieces at once. So Ben Feingold is in the audience here, is waiting for his class, which is coming up next. He always recommends keep your pieces safe, right? If somebody's going to give away their pieces, make sure it's your opponent who does that. So in a position of this kind, you look to see whether there's an undefended piece, and then you ask yourself what the result would be on the next move if you took it. And it just turns out, similarly to what we might see in a Petrov when this e-file clears, if instead of d6, black plays knight takes e4, he's just losing right away, right? Because he has a knight and a king on an open file, okay? And the knight is going to be very difficult to defend. If it retreats, we're winning a queen, right? Do you guys know this trap? Seen this before? So sometimes the central location of the king or the undefended pieces are what tells us not to go into a line of that kind. So,
Matt, in the previous
yes?
variation, but isn't queen g5 even better than queen d4?
Oh, okay, sure. So after takes, what about queen g5? Yeah, this move could be played. Is it better? I'm not sure. What happens? There are 2 moves that come to mind for me, and one is d4 and one is knight f3. I guess they both defend the knight. If knight f3, queen takes g2, rook g1, queen h3, I agree that I wouldn't want this position as white. I'm not sure if it's quite as bad as the one where you lose the e-pawn, but it's hard for me to judge because I just always told myself don't take that e5 pawn. What do the rest of you guys think? Would you be comfortable in a position like this as white? Is there any danger? What would black's next move be?
Bishop g4.
Yeah, bishop g4 looks like a move. If we play some random move and he plays bishop g4, what would we do to defend our knight again? Yes? Rook g3, and we're blocking the queen, and so maybe the queen goes back to h5. Yes, that knight's pinned, and this is going to be very annoying. I think I would rather play, knowing that bishop g4 is coming, something like d3, and then if this happens, you have several ways that you might be able to defend the knight. Knight d2, rook g3, and you can probably finish your development. Certainly don't want to avoid, you do want to avoid putting your pieces in these precarious situations. And once you do, you have to do something we call consolidate. That is, find a way to defend them and complete your strategic goals. So maybe on the next few moves, we're going to get our bishop out, get our queen off the back rank, castle our king, right? But looking at the position, black traded a center pawn for a wing pawn that was planning on helping defend the white king. I could see how you might not want to do it this way as white. So back to this game. Of course, traps like this are well known. I played castles, and I've actually seen a recent beginner breakdown class that Mike did where he talked about what happens after h3, h5, and this was a variation that had been played in a Fischer game, and people have really analyzed it to death, and there's some really bad things that can happen to white. You certainly don't want to capture the bishop. And presumably, if you've been to this class before, you're familiar with this, or this was the line that Mike looked at. He said, what can you do here? Maybe play f3 or f4, and after this move, it looks like it's just lights out. So, of course, I know about that line. Really, if bishop g4, I was considering playing something that the computer had told me I could get away with, a d4 pawn sacrifice after bishop takes and takes, something like this. But my opponent played this surprising move, queen f6, and it violates a couple of opening principles. We probably want to use the natural square f6 for our knight, and instead he's used f6 for his queen. And I may not have judged things correctly. Again, I'm following this Reuben Fine-like logic that eventually I need to play d4, and I like the idea of opening the center when my opponent's pieces are on awkward squares, and he wants to play knight f6 and he can't, and if he plays knight e7 he's blocking his f8 bishop, and his king is in the middle and mine is castled. And so I played d4 really with no thought. This was after having thought for about 15 minutes on these first 5 moves. So d4 takes, and my opponent played queen d6. Now what would be a more principled, more logical way to play this out here? What should black be planning? What is he trying to do? What does he want to accomplish? Where is he going to put his king? Can he castle queenside? Not with a queen on the d file, right? So what would be a way to set up castling queenside? Yes?
Maybe take the queen and move the queenside bishop.
Okay, that seems reasonable. So bishop d7, right? And then after something like knight c3, castle queenside, and black would be doing very well. To go back, queen d6. How many times should you move a piece in the opening? How many times?
1.
How come?
Because then you're wasting moves.
Yeah, think of the chess opening as a race. We want to get all of our pieces out and active as quickly as we can. And a move like queen d6 here doesn't get any of the other pieces out. In fact, it's almost an acknowledgement that queen f6 was not the right idea because the knight can't come to f6 until it's gone. So it moves again. And I abided by a principle here, thinking I'm developing a piece. I didn't play the strongest move, but I played bishop e3, thinking now if my opponent wants to play queen takes queen, that's fine. I have 2 pieces out. I have a castled king. I have a central pawn. And he has no developed pieces other than his queen, who he's invested a lot of moves in. So he went ahead and played that, and now played this very weakening g6 move. Now I think I was fortunate because although I wasn't prepared with theory in this opening, I was playing an opponent who was kind of winging it. And so this g6 move, it looks initially like he has some idea of pressuring down this diagonal. So is that something I should be concerned about or not? Are there any ways for me, and I think, again, to my lessons with titled players, they recommend not just thinking about my own moves, but thinking about what moves the opponent intends. And this is where we get the idea of prophylaxis, right? We want to play moves that are going to prevent their ideas from being successful down the road. So moving a lot of pawns forward is going to create some weaknesses. That's probably not to be advised. Pawns can't move backwards, right? But if you create a barrier on that diagonal, maybe that bishop is stunted somewhat. So let's say I played a developing move, knight d2, and my opponent played bishop g7. What's the best way to stunt the effectiveness of the g7 bishop? C3, right? And this is the kind of move that we want to get used to seeing. Even early in the opening when our development isn't finished, the move plays an important role. Let's say I hadn't played it and instead played something that looks like a developing move, rook e1. What might black do to take advantage of his pressure on this diagonal?
C5.
C5. And if the knight moves, bishop takes b2, and the rook moves back, and the bishop moves back, and he's just picked up a pawn. He's traded off his doubled pawn. But I don't really like the way my pawn structure looks here, right? So thinking prophylactically allows you to discover a move like c3, right? Okay, I played bishop f4, and I'm attacking a pawn. What's the best way for black to defend this pawn? On the one hand, he's just played g6, which looks like a committal move. It looks like he's planning on playing bishop to g7. Does he have any other options? What else might he try? Yes?
Bishop to d6.
Bishop d6. What do you think about the weakness of these squares here? Is it relevant if the bishops come off the board? Probably not, right? So if I played bishop takes bishop and c takes d6, and I develop pieces, I don't have a direct way of taking advantage of his g6 move. So it turns out that probably he should have played that bishop d6 move. Certainly Houdini agrees. So c3, knight e7, and bishop takes pawn. Now, things aren't going well here because soon, because the b pawn hasn't moved, I'm going to have an opportunity to place a piece on b6. And I needn't have had that opportunity. I think it just came up because, you know, he missed the combinative power of the two pieces. I played knight d2, and I was already pretty sure that something like knight c4, knight b6 was what I intended. So again, I recommend playing prophylactically when you have an advantage, but I also recommend playing prophylactically when you're behind. And a black player here who recognizes I've lost a pawn doesn't need to pack it all in and say that the game is over. There were things that could be done here to salvage this game. And perhaps the most important thing would be to recognize what is white planning. Certainly knight c4, knight b6 looks like an idea. I'm probably going to put a rook on d1 and a rook on e1. And I may be playing f2, f4 sometime soon, right? So here he played rook e8. And to be honest, I mean, as much as chess is knowledge and preparation and tactics and you know, who is the better player, there's also an emotional component. And sometimes when your opponent plays a move, you can tell how he feels when he plays it. And I could tell when he played this move, it was a physical thing, that he didn't think that he had a chance. And certainly that meant that my opening had been successful, whether it was due to the moves that he had made, the preparation that I had, or just dumb luck. I think in this case it was dumb luck. I played a4, and this is, I think you'll see, a way of trying to hold down the queen side. Again, thinking prophylactically that my opponent wants to play b5. But if he did that here, and we simply took, he has an undefended rook at a8, right? So now I thought a4 was preventing the moves that he needed to be playing to try to give himself the best chance. Just to fast forward a little bit, when your opponent is in desperation, he starts to look for moves that he wouldn't look for if he's abiding by the principles. And I think frustrated here, he played f5, and now everything wins. You know, certainly, as I say, the result in this game was not due to some vast opening knowledge that I had. It was due to the application of certain key principles. It was due to my recognition that my pieces weren't under any real pressure each time I moved, and that I had opportunities to pressure his pieces. You know, I thought it started with this somewhat counterintuitive bishop to f4. Actually, when I described it as counterintuitive, and Ben just left, he's probably bored, but when I described it as counterintuitive in my lesson with Ben, he said, why is it counterintuitive? It attacks a pawn. So I guess it depends on what your intuition is. Generally, we would say, don't move a piece twice in the opening. But when you have an opportunity to win material or to do something that you think is game-changing, maybe that's a reason to move a piece a second time. And here, I didn't see the immediate benefit of knight c3. Yes, I know it develops a piece, but I really liked the idea that my opponent had played this g6 move, and now I was going to make his bishop come over here. And somehow, he didn't do that, and so things really went well. Okay, now back to the sort of general discussion of openings. I don't know that the Scotch game is the opening for you, but once you've chosen an opening, you do want to get familiar with the traps that are associated with it. So some of the time that I've spent has been going through some traps. Here's another one. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, e takes, knight at g to e7. Now the most common move is bishop c5, and the second most common is knight f6. And both of these moves seem to make a lot of sense. Bishop c5 threatens my knight a second time, and I have two choices. I can play bishop e3, or I can play knight takes c6. Knight c6 is also very logical, and after knight c3, bishop b4, knight takes c6, bishop takes c3, b takes c6, and bishop d3. Now these are the moves that are played in the vast majority of games. So why is it that knight g to e7 isn't usually played? It obstructs the bishop, it obstructs the queen, and it certainly slows down the escape of the king from the center, right? So knight c3, g6. We had to move a second piece to get the bishop into play anyway. So g6 doesn't necessarily stand out to us as a major error, but the dark squares around the king just got weaker. And when pawns move, it creates opportunities for pieces to come in. Notice that the f6 square now has no defenders because there's an e7 knight and the bishop has not yet come in. So immediately you might think, what happens if I try to get a knight there, right? If the knight was there now, it would be mate. As it happens, white must think that way here, pin the e7 knight. This way the queen won't become a defender of f6. And after bishop g7, knight d5. And there's no one who can stop the knight from going to f6. He's going there on the next move if the opportunity arises. And this is where an inexperienced player might see a knight on d4 and say, gosh, that's attacked twice by a c6 knight and a g7 bishop. I'm going to take it. And what's wrong with this? It should be fairly straightforward. The black king is exposed, the f6 square is weak, and we have two minor pieces who can deliver a surprising quick win. Yes?
Bishop f6.
Ah, bishop f6. Yeah, we could play bishop f6 because certainly if bishop takes and knight takes king f8, we've got a good advantage. Is there something stronger? Yes? Knight takes c7. Oh, knight takes e7. Yes, sorry. Yes, okay, great. And now, not only can black not castle, but with his king on e8 and the knight still pinned at e7, it looks like there's no way to unpin that knight. Now, if only we had a third dark squared attacker, we'd be in real business, but we have a quicker checkmate. Well, it's not checkmate if black doesn't accept our queen sacrifice. So what's the move? Yes? Queen takes d4, and if knight takes,
Knight f6 and
Knight f6 check, bishop h6 check. So, wow. The black player was following principles, right? He was trying to develop pieces. He was moving a different piece each time. But because he created a weakness, he was vulnerable to an opening trap. And so I think as you choose your openings, you're going to want to make sure that you choose ones that fit both your style and also your knowledge. You need to go through some of these traps and make sure that you filled in the holes. What possible ramifications could there be from these moves that I'm making? Knight at g to e7 is not in itself a losing move. If it's followed up after knight c3 with d5, I don't think black is in terribly hot water. But the way he did play g6 just doesn't fit. So we study strategy, we study some games in the database, and we find opportunity. Right? Now this was from Bruce Pandolfini's Chess Openings, Traps, and Zaps. And if you get a book like that, or you get a collection of puzzles, you can find them online these days easily just by Googling traps in your opening of preference. I guess we have a little bit more time, so I'll just show a couple more traps that are kind of fun. Here's one that can backfire for white if white isn't careful. Rather than the Scotch game, let's look at the Scotch gambit. So bishop c5. Now I had mentioned this c3, and if takes, bishop f7, queen here. In this game, white played instead castles and d6. d6 is a pretty logical way to continue. So white very aggressively plays knight g5. How do we defend f7 and put pressure on white? Julian? Knight e5. Okay, bishop b3, h6, and white continues his aggressive play with queen h5. This looks reasonable, right? Because now we have three attackers on f7. The h-pawn can't take the knight because the rook would be hanging. So how to continue as black? What's a good way to get a piece out and defend the f7 square? Well, the move that's, yes?
Knight f6, is that one?
Yeah, knight f6 looks tricky. Is there a reason that he couldn't play bishop f7 here? Because king e7, and then the bishop will fall when the queen leaves.
Yeah. Also the knight of g5 will hang.
And the knight at g5 will hang. So yeah, so knight f6 I think would have been just fine. Yeah. The move that was played was queen f6. And now white makes a pretty significant error trying to apply more pressure. f4. Okay, so why is this move, and Mike has talked about this too, I know, moving the f-pawn can be dangerous. How come? Very simply, it makes our king weak. Okay, so what's the quickest way for black to take advantage of a weakened king? Yes?
Open the center, sacrifice.
Okay, do we have a move that employs the idea?
Bishop takes f7.
Oh, for black.
I'm sorry.
Right, so white just played f4, exposing his king along, and I suppose this gives it away, the a7, g1 diagonal. Okay, so d3 check, king h1. Now, what is it that's stopping us from taking this knight? Yes?
The queen.
The queen. If the queen wasn't here, this knight wouldn't be defended. Can we evict the queen? Yes. g6. And when the queen retreats, take the knight. And white thought, well, I can take a knight myself. And now there's a kind of a pretty sacrifice option. It's very forced. Notice that the bishop is stopping the king from going to g1. So what shall we do? Yes?
Rook takes h2.
rook h2. And after king takes, how quickly can we get another attacking piece in on the king? Our favorite piece is being attacked at f6. How do we get her in line with the king? Yes?
Queen H8 check.
Queen h8 check. And now Arjun, the follow-up?
I didn't have a follow-up. I didn't know the move.
Oh. Okay. You can pick another move. I mean, this move's pretty good, right? Because we're about to get checkmate. But what would you like to do?
Queen takes e5.
Queen takes e5. Okay. Yeah, that works. It just doesn't lead to an immediate mate. If g3, for example, and queen down here, you know, now we don't have a way to get in. But if we immediately play queen h8 and the king goes to g3, you see what we would do next, right? Queen h4 check, and after king f3, what's our best move? It looks like we have two different checkmates.
Bishop to g4.
Yeah, bishop g4 is a nice one, and queen g4 effectively the same, right? Okay, so it's interesting because as much as you think you'll prepare yourself by looking at a handful of traps, you also have to know that your opponent will have some traps in his own basket. And in this position, this sort of thematic fork idea doesn't work very well because the knight at c6 becomes a very strong defender. And so you might be rewarded at times for very aggressive play, especially in classical openings, but usually only against players who don't know the theory. When you learn the theory, you'll find that most of these positions are relatively equal with best defense. So the overly aggressive move is often punished with some strong defensive move. And I think knight e5 is that in this case.